Thank you very much, Esther Githiu-Ewart, and welcome back to Straight Talk Africa, live from Washington. Despite an alarming trend that a number of African leaders are bending the rules and amending constitutions to stay in power, a recent report by Afrobarometer, a nonpartisan Pan-African research organization, indicates that a majority of Africans say they favor presidential term limits. This leads us to our question of the week, which asks, with many Africans favoring presidential term limits, tell us why you think the restrictions are good or bad for your country. Thanks for using all our social media platforms to communicate to us. Let's begin with a comment from Straight Talk Africa Facebook fan, Guma Byuma Michael in Kabale, Uganda, my own hometown, of course, who writes, term limits are certainly crucial for fragile and young democracies in Africa, like ours in Uganda, to check the powers of the presidency and to ensure focused leadership. Our experience has really manifested that the longer the president stays in power, the more he slumbers and institutions go from good to increasingly bad. Another reminder that we are on Twitter. Use the hashtag VOA no term limits in Africa or hashtag VOA term limits. And if you haven't yet, please follow us at VOA Shaka. And speaking of it, let's go to tweet from Umar Munyagwa in the Ugandan capital Kampala. Term limits are good for leadership. They give a leader a time frame from which to deliver what they promised. We have another tweet from Miserinos from Kamenge, Burundi, who tweets, if you want to be fair and credible, retweet what Obama says on Burundi and tone down on the cherry-picking gentleman. Well, how do you respond to that, Professor Mwenda?
Thanks, Shaka.
You're most welcome, brother.
I think much of what we are seeing in a lot of African countries is a manifestation of underdeveloped democracies. Even in the US, historically, if you look at constitutional history of the US, it was only tradition. There was no law. It was only tradition from the George Washington era to Franklin Roosevelt.
Right.
That people or presidents observed a 2-year term limit. It was after Franklin Roosevelt went for 4 terms in the US.
Correct.
That the 22nd Amendment of the US Constitution was passed to restrict presidents to a maximum of 2 terms. But even the drafting of the US Constitution, if you look at the draft of Section 1 of that 22nd Amendment, the way it's drafted, it talks about holding power. By contrast, if you go to Russia, for example, because we want to make this thing universal and global, it's not an African thing. We find it elsewhere as well. In Russia, for example, Putin came back. And Article 81 of the Russian Constitution, under which Putin came through. I'd like to shift this argument or this discourse more leaning towards more the legal slant than the political slant. Because political partisan views will take us into all sorts of ideology. Sometimes we can't even justify them. But from a legal point of view, in Russia, for example, the translation of Article 81 says you can be elected as president for not more than 2 terms in a row. So the interpretation of that statutory provision is that not more than 2 terms in a row. So Putin cooled off and came back.
And of course
because it was not in a row. There was an intervening period.
Now, but who put in that clause? Right. Was it not under Putin?
Of course, I mean, and this is the argument. It will be interesting to see the type of constitutions. I know Rwanda is now moving towards a common law system. There used to be a civil law system. Burundi is a civil law system. It will be interesting to see what type of constitutions they have. For example, if a president is voted in power within parliament, can the judiciary interpret that as not being a term of office simply because he was elected in parliament and not by the general electorate? So these are questions of jurisprudence.
As you saw in Burundi.
Yes, indeed. And so these are questions of jurisprudence. And even so, one can ask further, does the Constitution provide for the electing of a president in parliament and not in the general, with the general? So if not, then the election was a sham in the beginning. Therefore, one can argue that the man ruled illegally. So those are some of the hypotheticals, but we need to look at the Constitution. What does it say in Burundi? And why did the judiciary rule the way they ruled?
You had 6 justices, in fact, judges ruling unanimously with the exception of one, of course, who headed for the nearest Rwandan political tall grass. Let me go to Florida 2000.
Yes.
Florida 2000,
Yes,
Florida
in the US,
2000,
yes.
Where you have a situation, frankly, where you can't declare a winner in that election between George W. Bush and Al Gore.
Right, I remember
And you
that.
bring the case to the Supreme Court.
Right.
And the Supreme Court ends up 5-4 in favor of George W. Bush.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people will say that, in fact, George W. Bush's first term was not an elected president. He was an appointed president by the Supreme Court.
Right.
Could he, in fact, have taken advantage of that and argue that my first term, I was not elected through a universal suffrage?
The U.S. situation is a little bit different. Like I said, if you look at the wording of the 22nd Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, it talks about holding office as president or acting in a capacity as president, not elected, but holding office. So that's a very important distinction. Then you don't go into who elected, where was the person elected. It's a question of just holding office.
I see. Let's move on to a posting from Paul Aki from Yaoundé, Cameroon, who writes, presidential term limits are good and it's a key feature of democracy. Term limits enhance regime change. Power alteration is a significant feature of democracy. Term limits prevent arbitrary and violent leadership. Power alteration through term limits helps to check corruption and abuse use of office by incumbents. Very interesting, because he's from Cameroon anyway, where of course you have Paul Biya, who has been in the power since 1982 and in fact went on to change the constitution so that he could hang on to power.